Good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Bastani. Tonight I have the immeasurable pleasure of being joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Kieran, how are we?
I'm very well, Aaron. I have to say, however, that I am a little disappointed. I deliberately wore what I thought was a very Bastani coded t-shirt in the hope that we might match. And to my horror, I discovered that you're wearing a white shirt for the first time in God knows how long.
Can't believe it. Head in hand stuff. It's a nice top, by the way, Kieran. I'm going to ask you where you got that after the show, but I'm wearing a white shirt. A good friend of mine always said, if you've ever had a big night out, you got up late, you feel like a shambles, you haven't slept well, put on an ironed white shirt, you feel like $1 million. Well, I slept very badly last night, but you know what? I feel great. Maybe the white shirt has something to do with it. Coming up tonight, Donald Trump has met with El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, to discuss mass deportations. Bernie Sanders and AOC are on tour across the US. We hear from Unite the Union on the Birmingham Bin Strikes. And Liz Truss is threatening to launch her own social media network. Really strange but interesting story right at the end of tonight's show. It's almost 2 months since Trump and Zelensky's infamous showdown in the Oval Office. But the Ukrainian president is still on Trump's mind.
The mistake was letting the war happen. If Biden were competent, and if Zelensky were competent, and I don't know that he is, we had a rough session with this guy over here. He just kept asking for more and more. He's always looking to purchase missiles, He's against, listen, when you start a war, you got to know that you can win the war, right? You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people give you some missiles.
Trump there saying that Zelensky started the war. He's blaming Zelensky for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, that's nothing new for the Trump administration, but it has added insult to injury for Ukraine, given it came in the same week that Russia mounted a deadly attack on the city of Sumy.
In Sumy, for weeks now, under intensifying Russian attack, expectations of safety had long gone. But this strike on a sunny Palm Sunday morning was a further escalation still. The city centre, close to where people had been gathering for church services, ripped apart by 2 Russian ballistic missiles. Bodies strewn on the ground. A young girl in her mother's arms, just one of the dozens wounded.
Volodymyr Zelensky has also been speaking to the American media, where he hit out in particular at Vice President J.D. Vance.
I believe, sadly, Russian narratives are prevailing in the U.S. How is it possible to witness our losses and our suffering, to understand what the Russians are doing, and to still believe that they are not the aggressors, that they did not start this war? This speaks to the enormous influence of Russia's information policy on America, on U.S. politics and U.S. politicians.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
And Zelensky told us he heard Russia's narrative from Trump officials in that disastrous Oval Office meeting in February.
You're gambling with World War III.
Zelensky grew tense as President Trump said both sides were suffering, Ukraine's people and the Russian invasion force. It's a shift in tone, a shift in reality, really. Yes, a shift in reality. And I don't want to engage in the altered reality that is being presented to me. First and foremost, we did not launch an attack to start the war. It seems to me that the vice president is somehow justifying Putin's actions. I tried to explain. You can't look for something in the middle. There is an aggressor and there is a victim. The Russians are the aggressor and we are the victim.
Vance has himself pushed back against that narrative, telling the website Unheard this: I've tried to apply strategic recognition that if you want to end the conflict, you have to try to understand where both the Russians and the Ukrainians see their strategic objectives. That doesn't mean you morally support the Russian cause or that you support the full-scale invasion, but you do have to try to understand what are their strategic red lines. In the same way, you have to try to understand what the Ukrainians are trying to get out of the conflict. I think it's sort of absurd for Zelensky to tell the American government which is currently keeping his entire government and war effort together, that we're somehow on the side of the Russians. Kind of tangential to the point of declaring, as Trump did, that Zelensky and Ukraine are responsible for being invaded. Kieran, we'll go back to the interview with JD Vance in a moment with Unheard. Super interesting. He makes lots of really notable points. What do you make, though, of the latest round of barbs and the beef between Zelensky and the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, none of them care what I think, but my patience is running very thin with it, actually, because, I mean, I initially was willing to give a good deal of, I don't know what you want to call it, latitude, goodwill, whatever, to Trump's new approach. As ridiculous as that might sound, I think I was criticized for it. We were criticized for it, maybe. And I think, this is the kind of situation in which you say something and all sides are disappointed. Nonetheless, just a caveat on all of that, there is no criticism whatsoever of Putin's obstructionism in any of this, which makes me think that it's a heavily loaded dice. Now, a lot of people will say, well, it was always going to be. Maybe so. But I hoped, and I think others hoped, credible people hoped, that this would be a kind of, but this might be the situation in which Trump's enormous ego is the broken clock that's right twice a day. And that Russian-Ukraine peace or truce or whatever you want to call it might be one of those 2 times a day. But it's a very high stakes, high risk strategy, right? Because if things start to go wrong with the peace of the century or the deal of the century or whatever it is that Trump is proffering and kind of grandstanding on the basis of his ability to deliver, then it has to be someone else's fault. It's paramount that it's everyone else's fault or someone else's fault. And it's very clear to me. And by the way, we're taught, I was always taught, don't personalize politics. Try as often as you can to depersonalize politics, because, that's what the vulgar political establishment wants you to do, or the media class wants you to do. It wants you to talk about personalities and ignore wider structures, and power dynamics and so on at play. The thing is, that's all very true, but with Trump, it becomes so much about his personality because it's foisted so front and center. And so I can hear myself talking about his personality and I almost feel like I'm not giving good value, or it's icky somehow, or, but actually it's impossible to talk about this without talking about the kind of personalities involved and the sort of bullying. There has clearly been a lot of very low grade, vulgar bullying going on. And it just seems to me that any hope I might have staked initially on Trump shaking things up from the kind of Biden Zelensky consensus, and by shaking things up, by being disruptive, finding some incredible or implausible route to peace, that I'm willing to admit is looking increasingly tenuous.
Yeah. The idea that Trump has a plan, or you can ascribe rationality to him, I think is kind of unwise. I mean, people are welcome to disagree. Look, they might end up in the right place for the wrong reasons, but I don't think he really works like that. Let's return to the Vance interview. Super interesting, which mainly concerned American relations with Europe. The vice president is, of course, known for speaking very negatively about European governments, including our own here in Britain, and saying they should do more to pay their way in the world. You might agree with that. But speaking to Unheard, he tried to put a different angle on the dispute. I think a lot of European nations were right about our invasion of Iraq, I disagreeing with it. And frankly, if the Europeans had been a little bit more independent and a little more willing to stand up, I mean, France did stand up or whatever, then maybe we could have saved the entire world. We could have said, you did it. You did the disaster. We could have saved the entire world from the strategic disaster that was the American-led invasion of Iraq. If only you stopped us, we could have saved the world, rather than destroy it, which was us. I don't want the Europeans to just do whatever the Americans tell them to do. I don't think it's in their interest, and I don't think it's in our interests either. Super interesting. Does he actually mean that? The American media, political class was villainizing, demonizing Jacques Chirac Dominique de Villepin, the French political establishment, for rejecting the basis for war in Iraq in 2003. They were villainized. They were calling French fries freedom fries. They were calling the French cheese-eating surrender monkeys. But apparently, if only France had been a bit more prominent, then maybe the United States wouldn't have invaded Iraq. Come on, be serious. That's J.D. Vance saying he'd like a more independent Europe, so they should stand up against stupid American wars. Not a bad point. I kind of agree, although it's basically implausible. His foreign policy assumptions are certainly curious, though. I don't think that Europe being more independent is bad for the United States. It's good for the United States. Just going back through history, I think, frankly, and we're going back here to the 50s, the British and the French were certainly right in their disagreements with Eisenhower about the Suez Canal. That's kind of wild, right? 70 years ago, foreign policy call we made was really bad. By the way, I disagree, actually. It's one of the rare times the Americans were in the right about anything after the Second World War. So Vance thinks the Iraq War was bad, but that Israel, France, and Britain were correct in trying to topple Nasser in the 1950s. Kieran, whatever you think of this, it's a huge shift, a huge change from the political common sense of America's elite, certainly from anybody who's going to ascend to the level of a president or vice president. How do you make sense of this?
Well, the first thing I have to conclude in order to make sense of it is that he doesn't know what happened in 1956 with the Suez Canal crisis. That's the first thing. And, this is of a piece with things that J.D. Vance has done pretty recently, pretty publicly, right? He, correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, but he I believe, went toe-to-toe with Rory Stewart about some aspect of theology. I think it was his very eccentric kind of love thy neighbor, second to thyself, as opposed to love. So, positing himself as a kind of theological expert or supremo, and was handed his backside in the process because he was completely wrong in his interpretation. We all know somebody like J.D. Vance. They're almost invariably men, and they've been told their entire lives that they're fantastic and, irrelevant of what's going on in the external world. And as a result, they have, I think, what they like to call in the psychoanalytic community, Dunning-Kruger, the ability, the impression of the ability vastly outstrips the ability. If there is any discursive sense to be made of what I think is a pretty incoherent pot of slop in that Unheard article, if I'm perfectly honest, interesting ideas maybe, but totally incoherent. If there's anything to be made sense from it, it's that the Trump administration knows its electoral ABC, right? It knows that it is performatively isolationist. It knows that it has to be against the old wars. So it's opposed to the wars of 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's performatively isolationist because while it's saying all these things, it's bombing Yemen. It's supporting Israel commit a genocide. So yeah, it's the trounce the old wars bad, but wars from 20 years ago, Bush, Obama, corrupt politicians, political class, etc., etc. It's all coded in that way. But wars of the present, good. New wars, not real wars, mega.
I think somebody's doing some DIY next to Kieran. We're going to sort that out. It is interesting. On the one hand, is it contrarianism? I think partly. I think J.D. Vance likes to be the guy who has the take which nobody else has and is proven right. But I also think, it's really convenient to talk about stuff in the past when, like you say, Kieran, stuff in the present is going really badly wrong. It makes total sense that you want to talk and relitigate the Suez crisis when the US is really signing off a blank check for genocide and ethnic cleansing in West Asia, which is going to have huge consequences from displaced people to potential failed states elsewhere in the region to discrediting the West in the eyes of the world to undermining the credibility of international institutions like, the ICC or the ICJ, depending who you are, by the way, from the left or the right, pro or anti-Israel. It's going to have huge consequences. So I think in the middle of all that, you start talking about the Suez crisis, Anthony Eden. I think there's a reason for that. Lastly, the part of the Vance interview which has gained the most attention in the UK concerned the possibility of a US-UK trade agreement. The president really loves the United Kingdom. That's President Trump, of course. He loved the Queen. He admires and loves the King. It is a very important relationship, and he's a businessman and has a number of important business relationships in Britain. But I think it's much deeper than that. There's a real cultural affinity, and of course, fundamentally, America is an Anglo country. I think there's a good chance that, yes, we'll come to a great agreement that's in the best interest of both countries. A great agreement, very Trumpian. Kieran, should that be music to our ears that we're facing an imminent trade deal with the United States?
Well, first of all, the banging seems to have stopped. I don't know if it was work or because I'm talking very loudly, but let's see. I think it's the worst music I've heard in a long time. I'm not encouraged at all by anything any of them say, and I'm sorry to collapse into what might seem kind of glib and lazy stereotypes about Trump and his administration. But, we hear this, it's like a sort of random access memory type thing, and they're just, it's constant psychobabble. So I don't know. Does Trump love the King? I'm sure he does. Does Trump love Keir Starmer because Keir Starmer was sycophant par excellence when he was in Washington last? I'm sure he does. He loves courtiers, after all. But does that mean anything in terms of fostering ties, transatlantic ties? Does that mean anything in terms of trade deals and so on, so on, so on? It's like, I don't know, trying to pin jelly to a wall. I really don't know.
Well, if anything else, I think it's probably a very bad deal for our farmers. Yeah, fascinating, isn't it? The right, on the one hand, say we have to look after our farmers. On the other hand, they're saying we need a free trade agreement with the world's largest agricultural exporter, the world's largest producer of wheat and beef and chicken. You think that's going to be good for our farmers? They can't compete on cost with the beef and chicken and other foodstuffs produced in the United States. They're all going to go out of business. You think that's going to help them? They seem very selective about this stuff. It's almost like they don't actually think about stuff in the round. They don't have a fully worked out worldview. Donald Trump and El Salvador's Nayib Bukele have a lot in common. They're both big fans of cryptocurrencies, with Trump having infamously launched his own meme coin, and Bukele having attempted to found an entire Bitcoin city. They're also both dangers to press freedom. Trump has barred news agencies from press conferences for disagreeing with him, how dare they, and threatened TV networks for airing critical interviews. And in El Salvador, journalists critical of Bukele have been intimidated and even arrested. Above all, though, both Trump and Bukele are big fans of locking people up without recourse to due process. Over recent weeks in the United States, student activists have been arrested by ICE and detained without charge. And in El Salvador, Bukele has locked up more than 1% of the entire population of the country for alleged involvement in gangs. And on Monday, these two bosom buddies had a cozy chat in the Oval Office.
Sometimes they say that we imprisoned thousands. I like to say that we actually liberated millions. So,
That's very good. Who gave him that line? Do you think I can use that?
Yes. And in fact, Mr. President, you have 350 million people to liberate. Yeah. But to liberate 350 million people, you have to imprison some. That's the way it works, right? You cannot just free the criminals and think crime's going to go down magically. You have to imprison them so you can liberate 350 million Americans that are asking for the end of crime and the end of terrorism. And it can be done. You're doing it already.
1% of the entire population's in prison. If that was the United Kingdom, 680,000 people will be incarcerated. 680,000 people. I don't think the most pro-police, right-wing reactionary thinks that 680,000 people in the UK should be in prison. Maybe I'm wrong. 680,000 people. Where would you even put them? Anyway, Nayib Bukele is certainly an interesting politician. He's actually, has to be said, very popular in El Salvador because of his record of bringing down crime. But he's also shown little interest in due process or protecting individual rights, of course, the basis of the American Constitution. And in grim fashion, he and Trump are now working together to bring that agenda to the US. In March this year, over 200 Venezuelan nationals were deported from the United States to a maximum security prison in El Salvador. The Trump administration claims these were all violent gang members, but there was no due process. And at least one of the deportees was found to be a gay makeup artist with absolutely no connections to gangs. The evidence that led to him being deported was 2 tattoos of crowns above the name of his mum and dad. Another man who was deported to El Salvador, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, has become the focus of a constitutional crisis. The US government admitted Abrego Garcia was deported due to an administrative error, and the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the government should facilitate his return. But the Trump administration has refused to comply. They say that as a citizen of El Salvador, that's a decision for El Salvador. What happens next is up to Bukele. And Bukele has made his stance pretty clear.
How can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
But you can release him inside El Salvador.
Yeah, but I'm not releasing, we're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. We just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into the releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
Well, they'd love to have a criminal, released into our
country. There's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick. These are sick people.
They would love criminals being released as sick. He's talking to the press corps in the Oval Office. The reference there to Abrego Garcia, by the way, being a terrorist, doesn't seem to have any grounding in fact. Zero. The US government under Trump has recently designated the MS-13 gang a terrorist organization, but this particular man has never been found to have been a member. In 2019, a judge did suggest it was plausible he was a member, but another judge has questioned the evidence used. Judge Paula Zinnis has been overseeing the efforts to bring Mr. Abrego Garcia back to the United States, and she said this: the evidence against Abrego Garcia consisted of nothing more than his Chicago Bulls hat and hoodie, and a vague, uncorroborated allegation from a confidential informant claiming he belonged to MS-13's Western clique in New York, a place he has never lived. Apparently that makes you a terrorist. The deportation of Abrego Garcia thus suggests that if you aren't an American citizen, your right to reside in the country can be withdrawn under the flimsiest of pretexts. It's basically a joke for the president in the Oval Office. Indeed, we've already seen this with a number of other cases concerning international students, some of which had green cards. But Trump also made a comment in that meeting with Bukele that suggested even US citizens shouldn't be too relaxed. Asked if he would like to send more people to El Salvadorian prisons, he said this:
they're great facilities, very strong facilities, and they don't play games. I'd like to go a step further. I said it to Pam. I don't know what the laws are. We always have to obey the laws, but we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country, but you'll have to be looking at the laws on that, Steve, okay?
This is really extraordinary. We've already had somebody who was legally in the United States sent effectively to a detention camp overseas because they were wearing a Chicago Bulls cap, and an informant said they knew them from New York, even though they'd never been to New York. We know of somebody else, a gay hairdresser, with absolutely no connection to organized crime that's been proven, also sent there. So clearly, mistakes are being made here, right? And yet, we're going to use the exact same process for American nationals. Kieran, this feels like a real escalation to me in the Trump presidency. People talk about Trump as an autocrat, authoritarian all the time. Sometimes you agree, sometimes you disagree. It might be hyperbole, whatever. But the fact he's ignoring the Supreme Court, and to repeat, their finding was 9-0. And the Supreme Court is majority conservative. They're conservative leaning, right? He's ignored the Supreme Court, and he's openly talking about US nationals being sent overseas to detention camps. I find that really concerning. And clearly he doesn't care about the people that are already over there. So what, would they go there before actually facing trial? Would they just be sent there while facing trial, but actually they stay there forever, kind of Guantanamo style? I mean, this is where we are now. Basically, Guantanamo style treatment for people who may not even have been proven guilty under the US judicial system. Am I being sort of dramatic here? You probably agree with the broad outlines, but is this the most troubling thing so far about the Trump presidency?
Well, I mean, it's always tempting, isn't it, with all the liberal cope about, all the establishment cope about Trump, to sort of be contrarian or go against the grain and say, no, this has been going on in some form or another for years. You just care now because it's concentrated in the person of Donald Trump. But no, you can illustrate how unprecedented this is with history, Aaron. I mean, so Alexander Hamilton, famous founding father, and the namesake of the hit musical Hamilton, famously said that the Supreme Court is the weakest branch of government because it has no army in any way, shape, or form. It has no recourse, no mechanism to command the army. And of course, he's talking at a very different time. But there has never been a situation in US history where a president has gone against the ruling of the Supreme Court. Now, of course, Trump hasn't done that yet, and it remains to be seen whether he will. And I think there's still a kind of broad expectation that ultimately he won't. But never in the history of the United States has a president actually gone against the Supreme Court. There have been states that have gone against the Supreme Court, and there have been very disgruntled publicly with Supreme Court decisions, but none have ever gone against a Supreme Court decision. It's interesting, I think, and it's worth mentioning because of what I want to say in a sec. When states go against the Supreme Court historically, it's almost invariably around race. So Georgia, I won't go into loads of examples, but Georgia, the state of Georgia, went against the Supreme Court de facto in 1832 around issues to do with Native Americans on reservations choosing to do things that the state of Georgia didn't want them to do. And the Supreme Court intervened and said they're allowed to do those things, and Georgia didn't comply. But the president, despite being very sympathetic, a guy called Andrew Jackson, ultimately went with the court. Other examples, Brown versus the Board of Education. So Alabama, desegregation of schools. Ultimately, Supreme Court rules that schools have to be desegregated. Alabama goes against it. And the National Guard is called in because the president complies. So I don't think that you're being melodramatic or overdramatic or anything. This is genuinely very close to being completely uncharted waters, just as empirically in US history, not as a statement of, I don't know, born of ideology or anything like that, hatred of Trump, etc., just as fact. And I think that's very important, the points about states, if I do say so myself, because obviously I made them, but state and racism being the key factor that usually makes states go against dissent with the Supreme Court, because I think Trump is a white supremacist. I'm not saying that Donald Trump has a policy program that is purely white supremacist or is inherently white supremacist. Of course, it's tempered by any number of factors in the real world and in the real world America. But I think Trump, in his heart of hearts, is a white supremacist. And I think he is using crime, as any good dog whistle politician or has done very effectively over the past sort of 100 years. Or more, actually, if you look at Jim Crow South and so on in the United States, but also over here and everywhere. France, many examples of it against Algerians. He's using crime as a synonym for race baiting, essentially. And what he wants an America, again, in my view, I'm willing to be taken to task on it. I know it's quite a bold claim, but he wants to create an America for and by WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Now, of course, he knows he'll never be able to do that. He's not going to be able to deport every person in America that he considers to be non-American, ultimately because they're non-white. But there's always been this tension in America, and actually it's usually the white supremacists who win in American political history. But America's always sort of presented itself from its very founding as the kind of civic nationalism, the civic patriotism country par excellence. The first to do it and the best to do it. And, if you come to the United States and you subscribe to our values and you abide by our Constitution, ironic given that Trump wants to steamroller the First Amendment, you come to our country and you abide by our Constitution, you're in. It doesn't matter where you're from. Now, of course, that's idealistic. And in practice, it's always basically been run by white plutocrats and white corporates and so on. But there has always been at least this conversation about civic nationalism versus ethno-nationalism. And I think Trump clearly comes down very firmly on the ethno-nationalist side of things. And so he will use terrorism, he will use crime to deport Palestinians, to deport Latinos and so on. And of course, in El Salvador, under its current leadership, he's found a very compliant minion.
Who's Palestinian, by the way, in terms of heritage. I would just quickly, before we get to the next story, because this is really interesting, I don't know if Trump is a white supremacist. I think he's a narcissist, and I think he's a bigot, and I don't think he particularly cares about the truth and the facts, and he just wants to win and impose his will on the world. I think he broadly has the kind of politics you're talking about, Kieran, but I don't think it's a worldview for him. And maybe you disagree, and maybe that doesn't matter, right? But I think fundamentally he's a narcissist, and that relationship to the truth is so wild. And I know that these are all talking points from libs, which is why people often reject it. But it's true. Stephen Miller, one of his advisors in the White House, saying, we won the Supreme Court 9-0. No, you lost 9-0. But this idea that somehow reality and the truth is a thing, it's just not. And I think there's the heritage of this in the Republican Party when you have in 2000 Florida, and it potentially goes to a recount between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and you see people pile in. Roger Stone is one, a very close friend of Trump at that point, sort of a Republican consultant, etc. Somebody in that world, was basically a part of the Republican establishment post Nixon and whatnot, going in there saying, we will fix this. We will get what we want. We'll get the outcome we want. To hell with the rules. And I kind of see Trump as a continuation of that, a kind of deformed outgrowth of basically a post-democratic politics in the US. So I don't think he's an ideological figure, but I think, I do think broadly you're right.
Broadly, I agree with you in many senses, Aaron. I just wanted to say, I think the two actually can be fused. I don't think they're zero sum, right? So I think you're right that Trump is a narcissist and he's led around by his ego first and foremost. And I think any ideology is secondary to that, right? It's an afterthought. But I think everybody that's ever worked with the guy says he's a racist, right? His father was famously a racist slumlord. And everybody that's ever worked with him says, when he doesn't think a camera's rolling, he says very, very racist things. And, racism is, of course, an ideology, but it's also a form of bigotry, right? It's bigotry. And you don't need to have fully formed ideology to follow those instincts, I think. And so, at its more ideological, it's white supremacy. At its less interrogated, it's racism. And I think he's sort of bouncing somewhere between being led by his narcissism. As long as I'm in charge, I don't care what happens. But beneath that, I definitely think that there's a strong undercurrent of prejudice, and that also informs or tempers a lot of what it is that he does.
Yeah, on the dad point, that's absolutely true. Fred Trump was widely known to hold those kinds of views. It's important to say, when I say narcissism, it's not an adjective. This is an illness. I think he has it. I think there's a mental condition going on. It's not to denigrate people with that condition. I just think I don't think it's something he's in control of, actually. Donald Trump is unparalleled in his ability to make America's political weather. But Bernie Sanders and AOC are continuing in their efforts to counter his dominance of the airwaves.
It will always be the people, the masses, who refuse to comply with authoritarian regimes.
And your presence here today is making Donald Trump and Elon Musk very nervous.
All right, that was Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking at a rally in Los Angeles over the weekend on the Senators Fighting Oligarchy tour. Over the past couple of months, the two have been speaking throughout the country looking to counter the Trump administration and push a progressive agenda. Sanders says Saturday's event drew 36,000 people. And this week, they're continuing their efforts, making stops in Idaho, California, and Montana.
Isn't it great? They're going outside the usual home terrain of progressives. It's unusual to see a political tour like that, unless it's the campaign, of course, for an election. So it's going to be interesting to see if AOC or Bernie are planning to stand for any significant positions in the near future. Bernie Sanders is, of course, now 83 years old. So if this were an early campaign for the Democratic primaries, you have to presume it's for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's already lining up a strong critique of Trump's tariffs.
I hope that we all see now that the White House's tariff shuffle here didn't have anything to do with manufacturing like they claimed. It was about manipulating the markets. It was about hurting retirees and everyday people in the sell-off so Trump could quietly enrich his friends who he nudged to buy the dip before reversing it all in the morning. Donald Trump is a criminal. A criminal found guilty of 34 felony counts of fraud. Of course, he is lying and manipulating the stock market too. He is at his best making himself, the billionaires who back him, and the members of Congress who trade with him rich. Not you, not me, not the people. And to be clear, I don't care what party you are, Democrat or Republican. I don't care what position one holds. Members of Congress and elected officials holding and trading individual stock is wrong. It must end, and we must ban it.
Kieran, what do you think? Are the squad back?
I hope so. I hope so. I think it's a great thing. I mean, I have my reservations about how both of them in some ways have conducted themselves around Israel and Palestine. Those are serious reservations if we're talking about Israel and Palestine, or if we're talking about Palestine and the genocide. Those are serious, there are serious questions. But in my opinion, nobody on the left should really be finding reasons that this isn't a positive thing, right? I mean, we need to see more of this kind of energy. We need to see more of this kind of thing. We need to, as you said earlier, Aaron, start thinking outside the box. And actually, rallies are such a good way of energizing people. I don't think they're shallow. I think that they're really, really important methods of energizing people. And actually, they were so sorry. I feel like I'm banging on about US history today, and I promise I'll keep this very, very to the point. But they were really, really common in the Roosevelt era. So the second Roosevelt, FDR, he used them massively to his advantage, being on the stump. And obviously it was whatever people think of Roosevelt, it was certainly a leftward turn in American history. And before that, conventions and things related to Democrat conventions and so on, they were a massive feature of US politics. And I think they're a very, very good way of energizing a base. And obviously the closest thing we've had to it for a while was Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. And I think it was very effective in 2016, 2017, 2018 at energizing the left. So I want to see more of it, and I want it to expand, and I want it to come to the UK. The problem for us in this country is that the left is in such low water, and our political class is made up of such dishwater, like technocratic, bureaucratic figures, that a rally led by them would feel like a sort of cyborg, some sort of cyborg convention or something. It's unfortunately the kind of crackpot right, the reform, the Faragists, who are probably the most likely to lead a sort of exciting arena rally anytime soon. But I think we ought to try and change that. Yeah.
I'm a bit more optimistic than you. I saw Gary Stevenson in Westminster with his megaphone. I'm a bit more optimistic, I have to say. Also the American left is in a bad state right now. I think if I had to choose, I'd take the UK situation, just because Donald Trump is potentially. I mean, these are words that are so frequently used by libs. You're kind of like, they have to be wrong because I don't like libs. This is new. Like you said, Kieran, this is uncharted territory, defying the Supreme Court, sending US nationals overseas, potentially before they've even been found guilty of doing anything. This is new. And it's the F word, right? Sorry if some lib on MSNBC saying the same thing. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes, not all the time, not very often even. Right now, Britain's second largest city stinks. And I mean that literally.
Disgusting is the word for it. Absolutely disgusting.
It's just rancid. That's the nicest way to put it. It stinks. The roads of Birmingham stink.
A dispute allowed to get so bad, people say it's made them sick. And now, with no end in sight. The problem's been escalating since March, with bin collectors on strike in a row over pay. Thousands upon thousands of tons of rubbish have been on the streets since. And 5 weeks in, the ever-growing mound starts to get a certain aroma about it. You could almost describe it as a flavour.
You've got burger smells, you've got nappy smells, you've got all different sorts of smells. You can't even describe it because it's just so disgusting. But you can barely open your windows, you can barely open your doors. It makes you feel sick, makes you feel nausea, gives me a headache.
Really extraordinary to see those scenes. That report from Channel 4 News shows why so many people are keen for the Birmingham Bin Strike to come to a decisive end. Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner had begged Unite members to agree to a pay offer put forward by Birmingham Council last week. But this Monday, that offer was roundly rejected by those members. So, why is this dispute proving so intractable? Earlier today, I spoke to Zoe Mayou, a regional officer for Unite the Union in the West Midlands, to find out.
So this all began last autumn, really, where there was a consultation, which I'll call a sham consultation, regarding the removal of the Grade 3 worko role. There was never any, they didn't listen to any of proposals. If it was about cost cutting, proposals were put forward about saving money, so it didn't have to be removed. Who else would be doing the role? The responsibilities of that role, we still haven't had the answers to those. Someone else will be picking them up, apparently. Don't know who they are or what's been going on. And when the consultation ended, the sham consultation ended in November, our members facing losing that amount of money, losing a job, losing peer progression, we wanted to engage the council then as to, well, let's try and fix this. Is there a deal that can give them a financial compensation? Council didn't entertain any of that. We gave notice for industrial action, legal industrial action. They still didn't come to the table, I believe, because they didn't think our industrial action would pass the thresholds and we would get a vote. And we did. And then we gave notice for industrial action. And I think that's what sharpened their minds. But that was just before Christmas. We did have some negotiations then, and they offered us a paltry sum, £1,000, I think it was, and I'm more than happy to go on record and say that, which of course our members were, hang on a minute, you've seen the figures of what they'd be losing. We went into the Christmas, we gave notice and we said, we'll postpone our strike. But if you postpone the implementation of the removal of this role, gives everyone breathing space to continue. They refused to do that. So unfortunately, we started our industrial action. We started 1 day a week and then unfortunately, strike action has had to be built up just to really get the council round the table. Absolutely. And we balloted everybody because although this was focused on 170 people, the worko role, as I've mentioned, the drivers and the loaders knew it impacted on them. You remove a role who's picking up these responsibilities, but something similar could be happening to them. It has. A couple of weeks ago, the drivers were informed that they are at risk of losing over 10 grand worth of money. And they actually had a letter written to them last autumn saying they wouldn't be impacted. So unfortunately, throughout all of this, the actions of Birmingham City Council, be it through the media, be it through negotiations or not wanting to meet with us, has actually felt that the members can't trust them. Can we trust them? Or certainly the people in the room, or maybe it's people outside of the room. I don't know who's controlling it. But it's actually galvanised our members. Our members can see what's going on, and it has strengthened their resolve that it is impacting everybody, and people will not be returning until we get a resolution for everybody. So this isn't now the what was put forward to us last week was only focused on one part of that, on those affected by the worko role. And we knew it wasn't enough. We were still wanting to negotiate with the council. But because it wasn't believed that we consult with our members, which we do regularly, we put it to a ballot and it was rejected yesterday. We have a meeting tomorrow. Fingers crossed things go forward, but it's certainly the council that are holding these things up, not putting together or not putting cohesive business plans that they could have done last autumn.
You said that drivers were looking at being 10 grand down. With the original workers that were affected by this, they would have been £8,000 a year worse off. Is that correct?
Depending on where they were in the structures. So those at the top of it would be losing 8,000. Obviously within, there's a pay scale. So depending on where you sit with the pay scale, the same with the drivers would be depending on how much you'd be losing. But what people have to remember is this is year on year. This isn't just a one-off, you're going to lose this amount of money. That means next year they're going to be 8,000, potentially more worse off because of, you haven't got that progress. So we're not talking about just this year, we're talking about year on year. Bills have gone up, but ironically, many of our members live in Birmingham City and they've just received their council tax bill, which has gone up when Birmingham City Council are taking money off them.
You said that they weren't originally willing to get round the table. That's Birmingham City Council. Who are you referring to? Is that the elected political leadership of the authority, or is it the CEO? Is it the council officers? Who's responsible for not taking this as seriously as they should have done at the tail end of last year?
As it's progressed, we've had more and more senior officers of Birmingham City Council come into those meetings. What I will say is the councillors, elected councillors, have never come into those meetings. We've been asked to meet with them, but they've never come and spoke with us or in those meetings. Max Caller, the commissioner, or any of the other commissioners haven't come and spoke to us. I suspect from the media and what we're getting is, they have to go to those to get it signed off, to get it agreed, but they've never come to speak with Unite. And particularly, and more importantly, I would say, is they've never actually come and spoke with our reps or our members, because this is our members' dispute. It's not my dispute. It's not me as an officer or the other officers of the union. We're a member-led, and this is our members who decide what's going on. And they haven't even spoke to our members. So originally, we've had the service managers come in and the trade union liaison officers from the council. But now we are meeting with the head of HR and the deputy chief executive. And that's so I think that, I don't know if that's an indictment on Birmingham City Council about how serious they took this at the start, or whether they thought, those workers won't do anything, whether that's just the lack of respect they have to these people who do a good job for their communities, who, our members have said sometimes there's elderly people and they might be the only person that person speaks to in 2 weeks when they're going around because they have the same rounds. So I'm not quite sure if Birmingham City Council from the start understood the seriousness of this was, grasped the metal, which hasn't helped the situation to lead where we are today. You know, we've took industrial action 6th of January on strike. That escalated within 5 weeks, all out now. And this could have been resolved sooner, perhaps if Birmingham City Council had taken it more seriously. It's always been taken seriously by me. This is our members and we want to get it resolved for them.
I just want a quick point of clarification because you said something extraordinary there a moment ago, Zoe. 5 weeks all out. And even now, when this is a national story, you're talking to the head of HR and to the deputy CEO. You're not talking to the chief executive of Birmingham City Council. I mean, I find that incredible. This person will be on hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, national story. You know, Birmingham is in the spotlight and the head honcho isn't dealing with it. They're not showing leadership. Can you just clarify that? Because maybe I misheard.
Well, I'd argue it's now an international story. We've had people from America coming over, and even in Australia, they seem to know what's going on. So absolutely, we haven't met with the chief executive. I will be honest, she has emailed me individually about setting up meetings, but she hasn't come into the negotiation room. Now, whether she's delegated that to her deputy, I don't know what her diary's like. But what I would also say, we haven't met with any of the commissioners. And it seems to be that the commissioners, because of the situation that they were appointed by Michael Gove, that they have the final assent. So, you know, I could sit around and agree something in a negotiation room, but if Max Caller or someone else has the final yay or nay, then how do we know that that's not going to be reneged on or the final offer? It's negotiations. And I've negotiated with some big international companies that it seems like no negotiations I've ever done, where everything seems piecemeal and you're not actually sure, are you talking to the decision makers?
On the point of commissioners, just very quickly, and I've said very quickly a few times, there's such a complex story. It's important to, I think, just identify the essential parts of it for our audience. These commissioners are people that have been brought in by national government under the last Conservative administration because effectively Birmingham City Council was insolvent. It wasn't able to operate as it had previously. So these commissioners, you think that's creating an additional barrier to any kind of meaningful back and forth? And you said it's a unique kind of negotiation. Is that the reason why?
I think that's definitely one of the big reasons why. I'd also say within the council, you have a lot of interim managers who are on huge amounts of money. And whether those interim managers are adding this to their CV before they leave and just want to go, look what I did in Birmingham City Council, the largest council in Europe, and whether they actually understand how it works. So you're dealing with a lot of interims. And of course, that means they're not invested, I would argue, in what goes on in Birmingham because they're not going to be around.
So interesting. Not in a good way, of course, but it makes so much sense. I'll just ask this finally, Zoe. Obviously, frontline services, hugely important. People don't get involved in industrial action with frontline services lightly. By definition, they're highly, highly disruptive. With refuse workers, of course, there are concerns about sanitation and so on. Can you understand why some local residents are not just annoyed with these strikes, but aggrieved? I mean, it's potentially creating a healthcare hazard for them.
Absolutely. During COVID, these guys and ladies were out on the front line. They were frontline workers during COVID. They were going out collecting people's rubbish during COVID. And they were seen as important then. They now seem as not important by Birmingham City Council. And what I would say is the vast majority of those that are out on strike live in Birmingham. So their rubbish and their collections aren't being done either. So this impacts them. What I will say is some of the issues around rubbish collections have been going on since before this industrial action took place. Birmingham City Council talks about modernising the service. We absolutely agree. It did need changing. It did need modernising because these aren't new problems. They've been around a while. And what I would say, depending on which area of Birmingham you live in, if you live in Sutton Coldfield, if you live in Harborne, if you live in Edgbaston, your rubbish has pretty much been collected. But if you live in areas like Stoke Heath, that the more inner city areas, then your rubbish hasn't been collected. So I think this has exposed a wide divide within how services are put out, which is controlled by Birmingham City Council, into how they've tasked that. And what I've said, and I've continually said this whenever I've spoken to anybody, is, Birmingham City Council residents should be aggrieved by Birmingham City Council management. They're the ones that clearly don't know how to negotiate or put a service together and do it properly. If you did something properly, I might not like it, but at least you're doing it properly. They've just raised everybody in Birmingham City Council's tax. They've just, they've cut services everywhere in Birmingham City Council. And I would say, Birmingham City Council residents, what are you getting for your money? Because it has been cut back. However, you see commissioners, you see people at the top earning huge amounts of money. They're spending how much money on agency workers rather than resolving this issue and getting us back. So if I was a member of Birmingham City Council, I would absolutely be aggrieved. But what I would say is that's not down to the workers out on strike who want to resolve this and provide a good service to the people of Birmingham, but that is down to management and senior management within Birmingham City Council.
That was Zoe Mayou from Unite the Union speaking to me earlier today. Someone who has been keen to capitalise on the strikes has been Nigel Farage. The Times' Patrick Maguire posted this on X early this afternoon. Nigel Farage is praising trade unions and keeps declining opportunities to blame Unite for the Birmingham Bin strikes. He's a smart man. He's not stupid. He's not stupid. He has a core series of messages ahead of these local elections coming on May the 1st. He wants to take on waste in local government. He wants to take on high pay with regards to senior management in local government. And he wants to protect things like SEND and adult social care. Very popular. Will he do that? You know what I think. I don't think so. I wouldn't trust Nigel Farage to run a major authority. He's very good at getting attention, less so at actually running anything, but the messaging is quite compelling. If I'd never heard of the guy and I heard that and he was standing as an independent locally where I was, I said, great. This is fantastic. By the way, the CEO of Birmingham City Council is on £295,000 a year. Throw in pensions and benefits, you're looking at the best part of £500,000 a year for the CEO of the council. £500,000 a year. And that person can't make time for one meeting with Unite to try and negotiate a way out of this. £500,000 a year. 3 times as much as the Prime Minister, if you look at the whole benefits. Although, to be honest, actually, it's a little bit more than 1.8 times, of course, just the basic pay package. So let's stick with that. Almost twice as much as the Prime Minister. Almost. But I can't find time in my diary to address what is a global story, in the words of Zoe there from Unite. I don't have time, I'm afraid, to try and find a way out here. Now, people watching this or hearing might be saying, oh, no, but she shouldn't go. Why not? Isn't that what leadership is? You can find a solution. You can grab the bull by the horns when everybody else is saying, we can't work out a resolution here. Isn't that what leadership is? Why else would you be paying this person £295,000 a year? What are they being paid for? And finally, the point that she made there about the change management, the people there as interim managers, I saw this so much in higher education over the last 5-10 years. They go into university, they lay off 500 people, they put that on their CV, they go on to the next university, they say, I was integral in restructuring and cost efficiencies and cost savings, and they put it on LinkedIn and their CV and they find another job. You can't run public services like this. You cannot run public services with a coterie of people whose only thing is going from job to job, laying people off and actually not building long-term sustainable structures that work and are effective. You can't administer a state like this. You can't administer local authorities like this. It will not work. Imagine doing that where you work. Somebody comes into your place of employment, they lay off half the staff members, they have a plan, and then they leave. And then they sell what they did to the next employer. They do the exact same thing again on a bigger scale, get paid more money. They hop from one workplace to another. That's what we're seeing in higher education, in local authorities. These people are useless. They can't build anything. They can't administer anything. Yet it's become the norm under, well, particularly under the Conservatives, but it's still the norm. As she said, not a single councillor had gone to meet Unite, mostly Labour councillors. It's a Labour council. Where's the mayor? Metro mayor. Who is the most wacky person to ever be in number 10 as British Prime Minister? I don't mean in the last decade, although that's already a pretty decent list, but ever. Let's go back hundreds of years. Who was the person who was the most completely out of their depth? Let's be honest. It's a slam dunk, isn't it? It's obviously Liz Truss, Prime Minister for a whole 50 days. But as bad as Truss has been so far in her political career, from eulogizing cheese to being in a Mexican standoff with a lettuce, she seems to be just getting weirder. Today, she appeared at a Bitcoin conference in Bedford called Cheat Code, and she started by offering this diagnosis about the challenges facing the West.
What is the scale of the problem we're facing here in the West?
So the book is called 10 Years to Save the West. And what I am saying is unless we get a grip and change the way our countries work, the West will be finished in 10 years. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we have been threatened by left-wing ideology, whether it's excessive government spending, whether it's net zero ideology, whether it's things like DEI and ESG, whether it's Islamism. All of these things have conspired to hollow out our countries, to stagnate our growth, but also to present real threats to the way of life in the West. And I am a Trump supporter. I think that Trump getting elected last year was the first domino to be falling in the right direction in terms of saving the West, because otherwise I think that we will see China and radical Islam, two terrible partners, win against the West. That is the threat we face.
Two terrible partners. China has waged a domestic struggle against radical Islam in Xinjiang province. You can say they went too far. They interned lots of people, etc. I'm not commenting on that. They had tremendous problems with radical Islam in that region. Many documented terrorist atrocities. And they responded. And now you're saying that they're somehow partners. I mean, this just sounds conspiratorial, doesn't it? China and radical Islam, China, which is overwhelmingly not Islamic, and radical Islam are coming after the West. And she's saying this at a Bitcoin conference in Bedford. Anyway, Truss continued by outlining some of these specific problems facing the United Kingdom.
We're living in a country where things are deteriorating. It's a country in decline. Our towns and cities aren't what they were. We're seeing rising crime. We're seeing industry decimated. I mean, MPs have just been recalled to Parliament this weekend to renationalise the steel industry because it's uneconomic. So all of those things and we were the country that invented steel. We invented the blast furnace, and yet these things are being closed down. So what I am saying is the fundamentals that made our society and our economy great have been jettisoned in order to pursue some very, very dubious ideology. And we've seen it in transgender extremism. We've seen it in the rise of the size of government. We've seen it in things like net zero. And it has got to a stage now where it is damaging our society from within.
We lost industry. When did we lose industry, Liz? We lost industry during the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. Most of it was under Margaret Thatcher's watch. She actively sought to deindustrialize the country. That's just the markets. Suck it up. Manufacturing and production can relocate. That's just the markets. Well, do you like the markets or don't you? Because capitalists want to maximize their returns. They want to minimize their costs. They will relocate production to China if they can get away with it, or to Vietnam, or to Bangladesh. Do you like capitalism or not? People seek better returns. They want a return on investment. They want to make a profit. That's literally what this system is. And by the way, if they don't do that and competitors do that, they go out of business. And then worst of all, they become working class. That is the iron law of capitalism, is competition. So if I don't do that thing and other people do, then I'm a goner. That's what destroyed industry in this country, was the spatial fix of relocation to other parts of the world, besides other things, which, by the way, as I've said, overwhelmingly happens under the watch of Margaret Thatcher. But apparently it's the woke left and it's trans people and it's net zero, which has destroyed industry in this country. I mean, this is a remarkable statistic. In 1997, Britain still manufactured, it still produced more cars than China, as recently as 1997. So even after all the Thatcher stuff. But we didn't take industry seriously because as a society, our political class, our media told us that's not really important anymore. What you're meant to do is serve lattes and work in legal services and work on computers and design widgets. And actually, that's where real value is in the 21st century. You're moving up the commodity chain. Don't make steel and cement and fertilizer and chemical products. No, serve Starbucks. That's really kicking on. That's making progress. That was the myth that was sold to us by neoliberalism, not the left. And next up, Truss moved on to free speech, where she said this.
There is a huge problem with free speech, and people are being put in jail for X posts, but they're not being put in jail for looking at child pornography. I mean, it's an extraordinary double standard, two-tier system that we now have. What I also worry about is the way that stories are suppressed or promoted. So recently we've seen the promotion of the documentary, or not a documentary, the show Adolescence. I haven't watched it, but we've seen the promotion of that, the asking questions about that. And we've seen the whole issue of the grooming gangs suppressed and mainstream media not really covering it, only covering it very partially. So what you can see is there's a real push to promote certain ideas and also suppress certain ideas and to stop people saying what they think, which I think is incredibly dangerous in a democracy. And we can see this not just happening in Britain, but it's happening across Europe, with trying to deny people running in elections, trying to close down TV channels. And this is the kind of thing that we used to see going on in the Soviet Union, and it's now happening to us. And it is absolutely shocking that that is the case in modern Britain.
So some guy is barred, by the way, I disagreed with that. Some guy is barred from running as a presidential candidate, I believe, in Romania. And that's the case in modern Britain. We're just like the Soviet Union because people are watching Adolescence, a Netflix show. We're just like the Soviet Union. It's just like Andropov, or maybe Khrushchev, because there's this show on Netflix I don't particularly like. And the media aren't covering the grooming scandal, really. The Times, the Mail, the Sun, the BBC, GB News, Sky News. There's been multiple government commissions, most recently in 2022. 20 recommendations were made by that most recent commission. 20 recommendations. How many do you think were implemented by the Tories in the following 2 years while they were still in government? Out of 20 recommendations, 0. The government that Liz Truss was in, her party. But nobody's talking about it. We were talking about it so much. There was a commission. You did nothing about the recommendations. But nobody's talking about it. And going back to steel, we invented steel. Henry Bessemer creates the process for modern steel in the 19th century. Correct. Steel is first produced by India about 2,000 years ago. It's called root steel. Very impressive. I bet she doesn't even know that. Anyway, there's a fact for you. So what answer does Truss have to these new threats to free speech in the UK? Of course, beyond cancelling her Netflix subscription. Well, here's what she said next, and you'll want to pay attention here because it's really, really odd.
There are too many people who are just accepting it, and I do think this needs to be actively fought. And what I am doing is establishing a new free speech network, which will be uncensored and uncancelable, to actually talk about the issues people don't want to talk about. Another example is Bitcoin. You won't see much coverage of Bitcoin in the mainstream media. You won't see it being raised in Parliament to any great extent. You won't see it being discussed, on the main economics programs, even though there is a huge Bitcoin movement. And it is an attempt to set guardrails about what it's acceptable to talk about and what it's not acceptable to talk about. And We've got to break out of that. We're planning to launch it in the summer of this year. There will be more news about it fairly soon. I can't say any more at this stage.
We're all on tenterhooks, Liz. We can't wait for a new free speech network which discusses the standard talking points of Britain's biggest newspapers and which even dares to mention Bitcoin, that thing that nobody has ever heard of before because there's this total media blackout. What is Bitcoin? Well, you wouldn't know if Liz Truss wasn't talking about it at this conference in Bedford. Kieran, I know I'm sort of joking, and she is a joke figure, okay? I think it's important to take people you disagree with seriously, but she's a joke. She speaks in a more sophisticated, restrained way, but Liz Truss is basically Britain's Alex Jones.
I honestly don't know where to start. Aaron. I mean, is she Alex Jones? I don't know. She's definitely a shapeshifter. She's definitely an ambulance chaser. You can measure, I suppose, the quality of the post-prime ministerial career by how effective, not good, but effective they were when they were in Downing Street. Tony Blair has his gilded lecture circuit. Gordon Brown has his, widely disseminated media junkets. David Cameron has his Shepherd's Hut. Liz Truss has Bitcoin Festival, or whatever it is, in Bedford. It's difficult to actually think of anything. Genuinely, you could go line by line, everything she said, and find very good reasons why she's a massive hypocrite and why everything she said is completely contradicted by the example of her entire career. But the problem is that's even engaging in that kind of discussion is to take her too seriously as an individual. That's why I started by saying she is an ambulance chaser. She was, whatever happened to her in government, she was defenestrated, and now she needs to reinvent herself. And because she's, sorry, but, deeply unintelligent and unserious, she's kind of sidling around the fringes of what she thinks is going to be the new centre of power, or the exciting new centre of power. But she's not doing it very well because it's Liz Truss. But just take two examples. I mean, hearing her bleat about the condition of the world, the condition of Britain, after she was in successive, multiple governments over 14 years and was maybe not the architect, because I don't think she's ever been the architect of anything, but certainly co-author of many of the decisions that will have created the conditions she's moaning about now. And then, of course, blaming it on, as usual, the most marginalised people in society. So it wasn't me in government for 14 years that you ought to be blaming for all of these things that are a direct consequence of things that happened when I was in government. It's all the people that you're used to being angry at. There's a news channel that I sometimes go on that shall remain nameless. And the thing I always say to them in that studio is, not to the audience, but to the people who present the show, you are blaming the wrong people in order to protect the right people. In other words, you're blaming trans people, you're blaming migrants, you're blaming refugees, the most marginalised of essentially powerless people in Britain, in order to protect billionaires and the people who are the genuine architects of British society. I actually, to an extent, and this is something I guess in her favour, I genuinely don't know. And by the way, when they're doing it on this news channel, invariably they know they're doing it, I think. They know what they're doing. They know that that's what they're doing. In Liz Truss's case, I'm not sure that she does. I genuinely don't know that she realises that she's able to connect the dots in that way. And just briefly, I'll end on this. We mentioned Anthony Eden earlier. I think, if I'm throwing in my 2 cents, Aaron, she's the joint worst prime minister of the past 100 years, along with Anthony Eden. Both of them were fundamentally meaningless characters, but they did one massive cataclysmic thing before they left their relatively short time in government. So they stung like a bee and died.
Thanks for joining me, Kieran.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live show. That, of course, will be at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.